All right, today we're jumping into a really provocative idea. The source material we're looking at puts forward this concept that the Spanish language is staging a kind of inverse colonization of the United States. Yeah, it's a pretty bold claim, right? But the argument behind it is fascinating, so let's break it all down. Okay, so first things first, let's really get into this core claim. The whole argument here really hangs on one big idea, that language isn't just about how we talk to each other. It's a form of power.
And the source material wastes no time. It poses this question right at the very beginning. Is Spanish actually colonizing the USA? Now, this isn't just for shock value, it's the lens through which this entire analysis is framed.
So, this is absolutely crucial to understand. When the source talks about colonization, we're not talking about, armies and flags and conquests in the traditional sense. Nope. It's defining it as this massive shift in cultural, demographic, and economic power, a shift so big that it starts to challenge the dominance of English.
All right, now let's rewind a bit for some really important history. The argument here is that you can't really understand this modern shift without first looking at where Spanish came from as a language of empire.
And this timeline lays out a really simple but incredibly powerful fact. Look at the dates. Spanish shows up in the Americas way back in 1492. English? Not for another 100+ years. The roots of Spanish on this continent, they just run so much deeper. And, well, according to the source, that arrival was anything but gentle. The language was literally imposed with the sword and the cross as a tool for control. The text even calls this its original sin. It was used to pretty much erase or push aside hundreds of indigenous languages, all to build this one unified colonial empire. This whole mindset was made crystal clear right from the very start. Get this quote from 1492, the very same year Columbus set sail. It says, language was always the companion of empire. So this wasn't an accident, right? It was a straight-up, deliberate strategy. Okay, so let's fast forward to the present day. How exactly does this so-called reconquest actually work in the United States? Well, according to the source, it all starts with one just massive number. 60 million. That's the number. The source points to this as the engine driving this entire phenomenon. We're talking about roughly 60 million Hispanic people in the U.S. That is a demographic force that's just on a scale the nation has never seen before. I mean, just let that sink in for a second. The United States now has more Spanish speakers than Spain, more than Colombia. It's second only to Mexico. And it's this sheer scale, this critical mass, that makes this linguistic shift totally different from any other wave of immigration the country has experienced. And you can see the effect of this demographic weight pretty much everywhere. The argument is that Spanish has broken out of being just a private kitchen language. It's now in the public square. You see it on signs, you hear it in the media, you find it in government services. And here's the key difference from, say, Italian or German in the past. Those languages often faded over generations. But with Spanish, there's this constant flow of new speakers, and the simple fact that Latin America is right next door. That gives it this incredible power to not just survive, but to actually thrive and expand. So the big question is, how does all that demographic power actually turn into real-world influence? Well, the source breaks it down for us into three main areas. We're talking culture, cash, and the language itself.
Okay, so here are the three pillars of influence that the source lays out. First, you've got cultural colonization, the introduction of different family values and traditions that start to displace the older Anglo-Saxon norms. Second, there's straight-up economic power. The purchasing power of Hispanic consumers is so huge that it forces big companies to adapt, and that changes what you see and hear all around you. And third, there's hybridization, the rise of Spanglish, which is basically a new code that challenges the whole idea of a pure American English.
And if you're looking for proof that this is a real power struggle, the source says to look no further than the political tension. Think about things like English-only movements. The argument is that these movements exist for one reason. Because Spanish isn't just seen as another language. It's perceived by some as a genuine threat, a real challenger to the established order. All right, this brings us to what might be the most nuanced part of the whole argument. It's this central paradox, this idea that Spanish plays two completely different roles today, and it all depends on your perspective. And here it is, the core paradox.
On one hand, you go to parts of Latin America, and for many indigenous peoples, Spanish is still the language of the historical colonizer, the language of oppression. But then you come to the United States, and that exact same language becomes a tool of cultural resistance, a symbol of identity against the dominance of English. It's wild.
And this is why the source calls it an inverse colonization. The crucial point here is that it's not being framed as some brand new arrival. Instead, it's seen as a linguistic return, a return to huge territories. We're talking California, Texas, Florida, that were actually Spanish-speaking long before they were English-speaking.
So this all leads us to the final, really powerful idea that the source wants us to think about. If language was, as we saw, the companion of the empire back then, what does its massive expansion mean today?
And it leaves us with this final question. Is this a new kind of empire? An empire without a crown, an empire without a king, without any armies? Is it an empire built not on military conquest, but on demographics, on culture, and on the simple, undeniable power of a language that is reasserting itself on a continent where it's been spoken for more than 500 years? Definitely a provocative thought to end on.